Going to discuss, which I haven't done, I think, for a few weeks, some contemporary situations. And if at any point it sounds like Musar, I would repeat again what Reb Chaim once said. Reb Chaim very rarely gave a drasha in Brisk. I think the first year he was rabbi in Brisk, he gave a drasha Shabbos Tshuva and Shabbos Agadol. Other than that, I don't think he gave any drashas. And but when he did give it in Shabbos Tshuva, he would say, "I'm talking to myself," and whoever wants can listen in. I'm not giving Musar to anybody else. I'm just making observations, and some of the observations that I'm making, I think it's important for people to know. They will not be directed against individuals, particular individuals, but just in general. And in many of these observations, I will try to take them to heart to, in a sense, change my own ways as well. Okay, in Parshas Bo, the Torah says, Bo el Paroh, God tells Moshe, go to Paroh, because I hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, in order that I should place these signs of mine in his midst. And in order that you shall tell over to your, relate, is the way ArtScroll translates it, relate to your children and your grandchildren. There is some discussion. What does the word hisalalti mean? But the main explanation is hisalalti means that I toyed, I played. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought the makos, he brought the plagues, and initially Paroh would say that he's going to let the Jewish people out, whether it was for 3 days or whatever it was for, and then he would harden his own heart. But eventually, as a result of eventually what happened was that Paroh, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu hardened Paroh's heart. In a sense, the way it's commonly understood, to force Paroh to refuse to go through with his commitment to let the Jewish people out. So it's called toy. Moshe Rabbeinu goes to Paroh and says, let the people out. And the plague comes, and Paroh sometimes agrees to let the people out. And then God makes Paroh change his mind. So it was a little bit of a game. Okay, so there are a number of questions that have to be asked against this pasuk. The first question is, and that's the famous question that everybody asks, because one of the foundations of our belief is Bechira Chavshis. Man has freedom of will. As a matter of fact, the Rambam proves that man has freedom of will from the fact that there's punishment and reward. If there was no punishment and reward, if there was no freedom of will, the Rambam says, there couldn't be punishment and reward. And this is a question, and we'll get into it, that almost all the Mefarshim, all the commentators discuss. But the second question, and this is the question that troubles me the most, is this idea, you know, you're going to have to tell your children, why am I doing this? I am doing this in order that you should tell your children, not just what Paroh did to the Jewish people, and not just that I redeemed the Jewish people, but how I toyed with Paroh. I played with him. I made demands on him that he should let the Jewish people out. And at a certain point, he was ready to do so. And I hardened his heart that he shouldn't do so. And the question is, why should we emphasize this point to our children and our children's children? And then this question I heard from my Chumash Rabbi in high school, Rav Shmuel David Herman. He was a grandson of Rabbi Herman, of Mr. Herman, there's a famous book Artscroll put out, all for the boss. So so I remember when we were learning Bo, he mentioned that many asked this question. Go to Paroh, why? Because I hardened his heart. Should say, go to Paroh in spite of the fact that I hardened his heart. Why? Because I hardened his heart. This was the question that he didn't mention who asked the question. He said, some say. I don't know who he had reference to. He was a Talmud of Baron Kotler, but he did not mention Baron Kotler when he asked this question, so I assumed that it was not Baron Kotler. And he gave a very interesting teretz that initially I thought it was a piece of Musar, not so much an explanation. But I see that the same idea, whether it's the pshat or it's not the pshat in the pasuk, the same idea was expressed in the Rambam's Igeres HaMusar. The Rambam wrote a letter to his son, Rabbeinu Avraham, in which he gives him some sort of direction. There are those who claim that the version of the Igeres HaMusar that we have was forged. It's easy to make these claims, but it was pretty much accepted that this was a letter written by the Rambam. But so the answer that Rabbi Herman gave to our shir, and he said that some said, was because God was telling us, go see Paroh, see how low a man can sink. Paroh was the king of Egypt. Egypt was probably the greatest of the nations in ancient times. In architecture, in agriculture, in whatever area, it was the greatest of the nations. And the king of Egypt could be considered intellectually an individual that was on a very high level. And here we see, go to Paroh, because I hardened his heart. He is ready to destroy his whole kingdom because he won't give in to demands of God. In other words, go see how low a man could sink. And do not think that it's only Paroh that could sink that low. Sometimes we have trouble seeing our own faults. And it's much easier to see those faults in somebody else. But the idea is when we see those faults in somebody else, we have to take them to heart and improve ourselves that we shouldn't sink the way Paroh sank. And now that I harden Paroh's heart, you will see how low a man can sink. And it's important for the Jewish people not only to recognize how great God's salvation was, but to be on guard for the future, not to follow the path of Paroh, not to become another Paroh. And the Rambam in the Geras HaMusar to his son, he says, Paroh is the Yetzirah HaMitis. Yetzirah is commonly translated the evil inclinations. I'm not sure that's a correct explanation, but Hamitis, the true evil inclinations. What does it mean, the true evil inclinations? He's obviously suggesting that we have to use Paroh. Why did the Rambam write this to his son? In other words, he's telling his son that if you want to study, if you want to recognize the Yetzirah, what the Yetzirah can do for a person, or what it does against a person, I should say, then look at Paroh. Because Paroh in his essence was the true Yetzirah. What does it mean, true Yetzirah? How can one speak of truth and Yetzirah in the same breath? What does it mean? And now, but the idea is that we have to recognize, we have to learn how not to act like Paroh. And there is an interesting. I was once talking with Rabbi Yaakov Margolis, who was one of the teachers in the day schools in Chicago. I was very close with him. A number of his children were my talmidim. And he had learned in his earlier years, in Panovich Yeshiva. And he told me that Rav Shach, very often before he would go give a shiur, he would go talk to some of the weaker students, the newer students, and ask them how they explained the Gemara. And he said to me, do you know why he did it? Why would Rav Shach, before he gave shiur, go talk to the students that were weaker? And I said, and he said that was really what he felt. The reason was because sometimes, because of a person's sophistication, because of a person's knowledge, he fails to see the simple explanation, the simple truth. That's especially true if somebody comes up with a certain explanation and he wants his explanation to be right. So his sophistication could sort of lead him off the right path. It's interesting, the Lubavitcher Rabbi, very often when he would ask a question against Rashi, he would say, now, how would a child of 5 years old understand this Rashi? And what would bother a child of 5 years old about this Rashi? In other words, there are some times when a child of 5 years old understands things that an adult can't understand. And very often that's true because we have a predisposition to certain ideas and to certain explanations. And this is true about Paroh. Paroh did not want to let the Jewish people out, but even more than that, he did not want to submit to the word of God, as it was said by Moshe Rabbeinu. He did not want to admit that he made a mistake. And how often do we have that same attitude? Sometimes we have to listen to people who are less sophisticated than us, because very often they might be right. I'm mentioning this because even with the vaccine being given, we're seeing more and more people being infected with COVID. And people are not following the suggested means of preventing ourselves from getting sick. They don't social distance. They sit, even learn. They learn without, of course, learning is always good and very important and helps. But it will help more if you learn and stay healthy rather than if you learn and get, chas v'shalom, so sick that you might die. And unfortunately, people who are very sophisticated sometimes, on rare occasions, lead people along this line of thinking. But sometimes those that are not so scholarly and not so learned and cannot think of reasons to ignore the simple facts of life might be correct. We find very often Tanoim and Amoraim, they would have a question, they would sometimes ask a little child to admit I made a mistake. And we all make mistakes. Listen, when it first happened, I also didn't understand the extent of the problem. So I'm not finding fault with anybody. But we see now what happened. We see how many people have died. And we don't know the after effects of the disease, even for those who have been cured. We have to be able to say we made a mistake. We can't take Paroh's attitude. We can't make ourselves into another Paroh. And I think that there are other manners, and I'm just bringing this in, that unfortunately we sometimes turn ourselves into Parohs, little Parohs. It's very interesting that Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, on one hand, the two Aseres Dibros, identify with two different things. In the first Aseres Dibros, which we'll read soon in Parshas Yisro, so Shabbos is identified with creation. In the second Aseres Dibros, Shabbos is identified with the Exodus from Egypt. Now we can understand very well the connection between Shabbos and creation. But more intriguing is, what is the connection between Shabbos and Yetzias Mitzrayim and the Exodus from Egypt? And there are all kinds of explanations, and they could all be true. But I think one explanation is that Shabbos, what's the idea behind Shabbos? The idea behind Shabbos is, I'm not a slave. A slave has to work every day. So it's not just on Shabbos I'm not a slave. When I take off from work and devote myself to Avodas Hashem, so even the 6 days a week that I do work, I'm working. I have a job. I'm not a slave. I'm not a slave to my boss. I'm not a slave to myself. It's important to recognize that work is an initiative that I take. It's not something that that gives me a servile, that I should have a servile perspective. There's certain people, they don't have time for their family. They don't have time for spirituality. They don't have time to learn. They don't have time to daven. Why? Because they have to be at the office. That's a servile perspective. Work is very good, very important, but a person has to know that he's not a slave. We can't let ourselves or other people be our paros to give us a servile perspective. And then there's another way we can make ourselves into a slave. A slave, we say, Abda v'hapkera nichale. A slave likes a free life. He doesn't want to control his passion, his instincts, his drives. My uncle would talk about a person as a gavra, a person as a person, and a person as an object. If someone just allows his drives and his desires to control him, and he doesn't control himself, he doesn't know put limitations upon himself, so in a certain degree, he adopts the traits of slavery. Avda b'hafkera nichale. A person has to control himself. And that's also another way that we have to recognize we cannot allow ourselves to make ourselves into slaves. And The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, when he talks about the halachas of Korban Pesach, he says the emphasis on Korban Pesach, you have to do everything quickly. He says you're not allowed to break bones, because breaking bones to get what's in the bone, to eat it, that takes time. Korban Pesach has to focus on swiftness. The Jewish people were redeemed swiftly. But I think more than that, we have to get that trait of not postponing. He says, the Rambam says, roasting the meat rather than cooking, because roasting is done much quicker. In other words, it represents, from my perspective, the idea of taking an initiative. Somebody who moves quickly takes an initiative. A slave can't take an initiative. And then there's the Marsha. The Marsha asks a question. The Gemara, I think in Sota, says that Paroh, when he confronted the Miyaldos, the women, Shifra and Pua, who helped the Jewish women give birth, and he told them, if a Jewish male child is born, you should kill him. And if a Jewish female child is born, you can let her live. And the very strange Gemara, the Gemara says, Masa lahem simanim. He gave them signs to tell if the child is going to be male or the child is going to be female. And the Marsha asked the question, why did he have to give signs? Everybody can tell the difference between a male child and a female child. And the Marsha says the signs focus before birth. Paroh at that time did not think, I mentioned it, did not feel that he had the strength to issue a decree at that point that they should actually murder a living child. But he told the Miyaldos, Shifra and Pua, he told them, if a child is carried one way, you should assume that it's a male child. If it's carried another way, it's a female child. No, what's Paroh advocating? Paroh was advocating that to abort the Jewish children, to limit the Jews being born. I'm not going into the question now. There are hardship cases, sometimes cases that people's lives are in danger, that the halacha permits abortion. And there might be other hardship cases according to different opinions and in different stages of pregnancy, when there might be a heter. But if it's done just for convenience sake, then in a sense, we are putting the decrees of Paroh on ourselves. We cannot become little Parohs. And I think, so these are, this is the part of the idea, Boel Paroh kanir badis libo v'sleiv avada. You have to recognize what Paroh did in order to realize that we shouldn't, in order to be on guard, that we shouldn't follow in the path of Paroh. Now, it's very interesting that the Rambam in Perek Vav, he discusses the question as to how God could could take away free will from Paroh. After all, free will is one of the basic beliefs in Judaism. And the Rambam says, he says that no one should think that there isn't free will. And he asked questions about Paroh, about against Canaanim, about other cases. And he says that man has free will, but there comes occasions, special occasions, when person persists in seeing, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, recognizes a need to withdraw the freedom of will from this person. And really, this is based on a Medrash Rabbah. I think the Medrash Rabbah brings it in the name of Rav Shlokish, that to withdraw the freedom of will. And then he concludes, he says, so no one should say that the Egyptians didn't have freedom of will. And the question is asked by many. My father discusses in his Sefer, but the Rambam seems to contradict himself. On one hand, he says there's freedom of will. And then he says that God withdraws the freedom of will. And that's how Paroh, that's how God hardened the heart of Paroh. And then at the end, he says, and therefore Paroh had freedom of will. Seems to be contradictory. Some say that what it is that Paroh just, there is freedom of will at the very beginning, but the ability to change one's path, this is a psychological fact, the ability to change one's path becomes harder and harder if a person postpones changing his path. So on one hand, man always has freedom of will. But on the other hand, he chose to make it difficult to make the choice, not impossible, but to make the choice not to act, not to continue in the way that he did before. Now, I think, now there are many different opinions as to why, how God removed the freedom of will from Paroh. Some say, as I mentioned, that the person has initially freedom of will, but eventually God, if he sees a need, removes the freedom of will. And the Sforna and the Ramban, they both say, they seem to say, that the reason God did not remove freedom of will for Paroh. But when it says God hardened Paroh's heart, God gave Paroh the ability to persist to do what he wanted to do. Initially, Paroh did not want to let the Jewish people out of Egypt. And his desire to keep the Jewish people as slaves and under his rule and under his thumb, and they should not be able to serve God. That desire remained. But Paroh was feeling compelled against his will to let the Jewish people out. So when God gave Paroh, when God hardened Paroh's heart, it wasn't to remove Paroh's freedom of will. On the contrary, it was to restore his freedom of will, that he shouldn't feel forced by the Makos to let the Jewish people out against his will and against his wishes. And my father said that he felt, and I have some trouble with that explanation, that the Rambam had that opinion also. And that's why the Rambam says that no one should say that Paroh didn't have freedom of will. However, reading the simple words of the Rambam, it seems that the Rambam is emphasizing the point that after a certain amount of time, if there is a special need, so God will remove the freedom of will from a person because of the special need. Now, there are many causes for a special need. Now, for example, we know when it comes to reward and punishment, there is a concept of midah keneged midah. In a similar manner that a person sinned, so is his punishment. The Egyptians, they drowned the Jewish children. And because of that, their punishment manifests itself in the waters turning to blood. It manifests itself in the soldiers of Paroh drowning by Kriyas Yamsuf. Why is it that it's midah keneged midah? Why is it? Because the purpose of punishment is not simply to make the person suffer. There is an inyan of kapara in certain situations, atonement. But the main purpose of punishment, certainly of midah keneged midah, is that God punishes and rewards in order to teach us what is the right path and what is the wrong path. Sometimes the message is to me, the person who sinned or the person who did the right thing, to let me know this was the right thing or this was the wrong thing. And if it wasn't midah keneged midah, if there was no correlation between the punishment and the reward and the deed that was done, you would never connect the two. And sometimes, and many times, it's not just to teach the person who sinned or did the proper thing, but it's to teach everybody else that came under the influence of that person. So this was what the why. In other words, we could suggest it's not that after 3-4 sins, the simple reading of the Medrash Rabbah, although not in the Rambam, the simple reading of the Medrash Rabbah is after 3-4 times, so freedom of will is removed. But from the Rambam's lashon in Perek Vav of Hilchos Tshuva, there is another Rambam, but in Perek Vav of Hilchos Tshuva, the Rambam seems to emphasize that where there was a special need, sometimes there has to be a punishment. Sometimes people have to be able to associate the person who sinned with a certain attitude, with a certain deed. And had he not sinned so often, then there wouldn't have been that need. So I think that perhaps that's what my father meant. I think what my father meant was that initially there was always freedom of will. But if a person continues to sin, and as a result of his continuing to sin, there is a need created that necessitates his sin being identified with him, that others shouldn't learn from him, or that he should learn not to do the same thing. Sometimes it's necessary to remove freedom of will from him. But if there is no necessity, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu lets the person maintain his freedom of will. This is the way we could understand the Rambam. So in other words, even the Rambam agrees with the Sforna that the purpose, maybe in a limited way, but certainly in Paroh's situation, the Rambam agrees with the Sforna that the purpose of hardening Paroh's heart was in order that Paroh should have his freedom of will restored to him. That people should recognize who Paroh is. So we could suggest that's what the Rambam means when in the Igeres HaMusar, when the Rambam says in the Igeres HaMusar to his son Rabbeinu Avram, Paroh, hu hayetzer hara ha'amitis, he is the true Yetzer Hara. He's the true Yetzer Hara because the way the Torah presents Paroh is the way Paroh wanted to be. And Paroh did not want to change. And we have to learn from Paroh how a person can fall. Now, and we could say that to a large degree, that's why the Torah, Uleman tisaper b'oznei bincha ben bincha eis asher halalti b'Mitzrayim. You have to emphasize to your children and your children's children how I toyed with Egypt, how I hardened Paroh's heart. What's the idea? But the idea is, if you know historians tend to have to make history or to change history, to conform to what the way they wanted history to be. My cousin, Chaim Soloveichik, who's besides being an outstanding Gaon, Talmud Chacham, also one of the greatest historians, he said there are three approaches to history. There's the history the way it was, history the way it should have been, and history the way it must have been. And today we're encountering a lot of people who their understanding of history is based on the way it must have been in order to conform with their philosophy and their attitudes. So, and it's not unreasonable to believe that 100 years after Yetzias Mitzrayim, perhaps somewhat less, after all, when the Jewish people, by He b'shalach Paroh Asam, when Paroh sent the Jewish people out of Egypt, and our sages tell us he accompanied them along the way. He was giving them honor. That some idiot Jewish historian will write that who was the redeemer of the Jewish people? The redeemer of the Jewish people was not HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The redeemer of the Jewish people, Chas v'Shalom, was Paroh HaRasha. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to give Paroh to show the world, and especially the Jewish people, and especially future generations, who the real Paroh was. Boa Paroh k'ani ichbarti es libo v'sleiv avadav. Go to Paroh because I harden his heart. Now you'll see the true Paroh, what Paroh really believes. You know, it's very interesting that when Sadat said he's going to visit Jerusalem, Sadat became the symbol of peace. When Arafat Shemach Shemo met with Rabin, who was a mistake on Rabin's part, when Arafat Shemach Shemo met with Rabin, so Arafat became the symbol of peace. Some of the magazines here in Chicago would talk about how Arafat was the man of peace, and the Israeli prime ministers were not receptive. They forgot to mention about the bombs, the terrorism, the bombs that were placed, not military camps, but the bombs that were placed where carriages were. You don't have to wait 100 years to redo history. Reach the point we can redo history the very same day. And who? Arafat, Sadat, they're identified as the men of peace. It's President Carter. And who was the man of war? The man of war was Menachem Begin. What did Sadat give Menachem Begin? Nothing. No one mentions that about Sadat with the Yom Kippur War. No one mentions how Sadat's hero was Hitler Yamach Shemo. No one mentions how the economy of Egypt was falling apart. How people in Cairo were sleeping in the graveyards. And Egypt couldn't bear the economic burden of its military operations. So Sadat became the man of peace. And what is the result? Look at the college campuses today. Look at J Street, what the Jews in J Street say. Why? Because they became the man of peace. And those that were protecting the lives of their little children, they were identified with war. That's the redoing of history. So, I showed who Paroh really was. Future generations shouldn't be fooled. And we find it all the time. You know, people find the paper in the biography of the Beis Halevi, my great-great-grandfather. They mentioned that the Beis Halevi was prosecuted for murder because a certain story there supposedly was a din Torah, and whatever it is, and the person got a heart attack, and the little Hayad Var Me'olam was never prosecuted for murder, and no one ever died. Where did you find this story written? It was written in the papers of the government because they were anti-Semitic. So then, when they saw this in the papers of the government, we have a paper that proves it. Didn't dawn on somebody, maybe the paper is false. It's even quoted as a precedent in law schools. The Beis Halevi was found guilty of murder. Never happened. But that's the way it is. That's the way historians are. We found a piece of paper. One of the big things about Egypt, when you look at the inscriptions about Egypt, the only thing that's mentioned about the Jewish people, about very, very little is mentioned about a victory they had against the Jews. Almost nothing is mentioned. Why? Because inscriptions are written in a manner that that work well with those who are writing it. But stupid people will say the Jews were never in Egypt. After all, there's no mention of the slavery of the Jews and of the Jews leaving Egypt. The only thing mentioned is how the Egyptians had a victory against the Jews at one time. And I once heard my uncle had a meeting with a certain scholar, and a true scholar, not like the frauds today. And the scholar showed him manuscripts of Toseftas that said ridiculous things. And my uncle said it's Amaratzis. And the scholar said, but it's 1,500 years old, 1,800 years old, whatever it was. My uncle said to him, he mentioned the name of a certain book that was published by somebody today. He says, the person was a true scholar. He says, what do you think about it? So he said, he's an Amoritz and his book is Amoratzis. So my uncle said to him, you think they didn't have Amoratzim in those days? They didn't have people that wrote and didn't know what they were writing or knew what they were writing and wrote it anyway, which is worse. There's a very interesting story. I think I heard it from Rabbi Felder. He was a friend of mine. I very often would talk to him about shilas that I had. And Rabbi Felder told me that he once mentioned to Moshe Feinstein a story about a gadol from 200 years ago, 300 years ago. Yeah, a story about how great he was, what a chassid he was, and all this. That he swallowed his food in a manner that he shouldn't derive any benefit from it. So Moshe Feinstein told him he doesn't believe the story. So Rabbi Felder says, everybody says the story. So Moshe Feinstein says, look, you see the stories they say about me, and I'm still alive today. Can you imagine somebody who died 200 years ago and 300 years ago, the stories that they say? Today, history is made up on the day the events take place themselves. And the debate that the Ramban had the debate the Ramban had with Pablo,
Bartosa? Disputation of Barcelona or Bartosa?
Barcelona, yeah. The span in front of the king of Spain. So the debate, so the Ramban happened to write over the whole debate, so we know actually what happened. But Pablo wrote an altogether different text of what happened. Now, the foolish people that the Ramban hadn't wrote his version, which is the true version. I am sure there were many people, pseudo scholars today, even among the Jewish people, who would say, oh, look what happened, how the Ramban was defeated in the debate. We know the Ramban writes that the king of Spain told them that even though he doesn't agree with him, he clearly showed his side. And he he told him, he gave him money, and he told him to leave Spain and that's when the Ramban went to Eretz Yisrael, because his life was dependent upon it. So, but let's say the Ramban hadn't written it, or it had been lost. What do you think? You think Pablo would have written the true facts? But today we have fools that would believe what Pablo wrote. Now, I want to say, listen, I know so many things that took place. And I didn't get it secondhand. And I see the way people talk, and reasons to give people who had no idea what was all about. I don't go and discuss it. I'm not interested in discussing it. But it just, to me, it's amazing that just because something is written down, it's assumed to be true. And this is so the whole purpose was the whole purpose of Boal Paro Kanich Baratias Libo was man Yedu Doroseichen, that your future generation should know that your future that you should tell your children and your children's children, Eis Hasher is Halal to Mitzrayim, let them know who Paro really was, because otherwise we might celebrate Paro's birthday instead of Purim. And I think I mentioned it before, the pshat that Rabbi Wernick said, Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol l'seis dulu l'yotze bereshis. We have to give thanks to the master of everything, to give greatness to the creator. Now, the master of everything is the creator. It's repetitious. So he said it's important to know that we have to give thanks to God, that we could give thanks to God. Because today people try to hide what God really did. So this is the lesson that Baal Parkman Uman Tisapir Bosne Vincho Ben Bincha. Go to Paroh, because now you'll see who Paroh really is, and you should tell it to your children and your children's children, that just to make accommodations to their philosophies, to the changing times, they shouldn't change history. I know very often people on the right change what my uncle's positions were, and people on the left change what his positions were. Everybody, I saw a lot of the Hespedim that were written on my uncle. And most of the Hespedim has really Hespedim on the person who gave the Hesped. Everybody tries to explain history in accordance with their philosophy and with their attitudes. And this is why it was important for Moshe to go to Paroh, to let the Jews of future generations know who Paroh really was, how low Paroh sank, and how Paroh was determined that the Jewish people should become free. And if we know that, we'll have understanding about the chesed that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did for us in Yetzias Mitzrayim.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Please put it in the chat so we can ask Rabbi.
Sure.
It's not the same idea as of what your father quoted your uncle saying about the Perchei Kahuna throwing up the keys. We're not talking about keeping the keys to the Beis HaMikdash.
No, but that's
about...
no, it's not the same idea, but there are certain similarities. In other words, we shouldn't just sit and wait. We have an obligation, and actually, those are the truth is, those are the two approaches to Golus. There are those that see Golus that we should just sit and wait. And there are those that say that we have to act, take the initiative to end Golus. And ending Golus doesn't just mean raising an army, although there are situations when that's necessary. But ending Golus means that we should be on guard, not to assimilate among the nations of the world, and not to make Golus something that becomes necessary in order to improve ourselves.
Okay, I don't see any questions. Is there an idea that lave can be elsewhere in Tanakh associated with the mind as
Yes,
opposed to the
Rabbi
heart?
Yaakov Kamenetsky, I don't remember that I said that, but Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky mentioned to my father that he believes Lev in Tanakh, can mean the mind also. We say, below Susur Achrei Levavchem, so Chazal say Zu Minus, which is heresy. And one of the questions is always asked. Rabbi Kamenetsky didn't bring this raya, but my father, when he told me what Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky said, he mentioned this. So he said, "Zum minus heresy is usually in giving pseudo-intellectual arguments." So the Bali Musa say because a person makes these arguments because of his desire, and the heart is the symbol of desire. But my father said we could explain it now. In other words, you shouldn't allow your mind, use your minds to take you off the path of Torah and to create fake intellectual arguments as an excuse to deviate from the path of HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
Can you please explain again what Rav Wernick said about Aleinu?
Yes, Rav Wernick said, it says, Aleinu l'shabech l'adon hakol, we give praise to the master of everything, l'seis dula, to give greatness, liotze brachus, to the one, to the creator. Now, the adon hakol, the master of everything, he was the creator. So it's redundant. We're saying, give praise, which is greatness, speaking greatness of the master of everything, l'seis dula, to give greatness, speak in praise of the creator. So it's redundant. So Rav Wernick said it's a beautiful shot. He said, Aleinu l'shabech l'adon hakol, we have to give thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that we could give thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I said, he didn't mention it here, but we could use that thought over here also. In other words, it's important for future generations to know that the enemies of the Jewish people, the Parohs of the generations, didn't later become the friends of the Jews. Not to fool ourselves, because if we fool ourselves, when we make that mistake, we are taking away from our debt to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have to observe Pesach. We don't observe Paroh's birthday.
Yeah, so someone else is saying that in Modem we say we're thanking Hashem al shanafna Modem lach. We can thank you.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. So.
All right.